Carl Randall, we are at Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation House in
Mm.
London, a special place for both of us. Do you want to tell us about why it's special for you?
Yeah, well, it was 22 years ago now that I got the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation scholarship,
Mm.
and it was in this very room actually that I had the first interview. I think you were the year after me. You came
Yeah.
to Japan the year after.
And we are fortunate to be in the presence of one of your works.
It's a portrait of an American writer called Donald Ritchie, and he's like yourself, a bit of an expert on Japan. When I was living in Tokyo, I wrote to him and said, I love your books, can I draw your portrait? So I went to his home in Ueno, kind of overlooking the pond, that beautiful pond in Ueno Park,
Yeah.
and I made this drawing. I think it was about 3 sittings, and there's no photography used, and I just sat with him like we are now, and I got my pencils out. This is pencil and ink. And actually the writing here, he wrote that with his own hand. I asked him, I wanted it to kind of be a little bit of a collaboration, so that
Yeah.
writing is by his own hand.
We're talking a little while about your style as we sort of see it here, but let's maybe wind back first, get a sense of what it was that drew you to Japan in the first place.
Right. Well, it was mainly the prints of Hokusai and Hiroshige, the Japanese woodblock prints that
Mm.
I think that was my first window into Japan, probably when I was a teenager doing my A levels. I remember stumbling into the college library and then finding this magical book of these. I didn't really know what they were really, because I didn't have that much contact with Japan when I was a child, and just finding them really magical and this really strong visual style, and them just really staying in my head. That was my first kind of, I guess, contact with Japan, and then it just slowly builded on that until I found out about the scholarship that we just mentioned. I applied for it, got it, and then it started this journey where I spent 10 years living in Tokyo, and I made a whole series of paintings based on Japan.
Yeah.
Brought them back to the UK, exhibited them, sold them, and that was my project.
What was it that struck you about this Japanese art that was distinct maybe from what you'd seen so far?
Right. Well, I mean, it's obviously the subject matter. It's depicting a world very different from my own. But I think there's something about the very graphic quality of the prints. Very strong outlines, very clean, clear, bold colours. Almost like a kind of jigsaw puzzle of these very strong shapes connected. My intention wasn't to go and study woodblock printing or Japanese painting. There's a certain kind of documentary aspect to the work I make, in that I feel like I'm just recording what I'm seeing
Yeah.
as a painter rather than a photographer. So there's this whole wealth of subject matter in Japan that I was fascinated by, lots of layers to the culture and the society. I had an amazing opportunity to make paintings about this very rich and fascinating culture. I kind of started to develop this slightly flattening, you can see it in this drawing, it's slight flattening to the space where you're looking down on space, but you're looking at the people from the side. So there's kind of slight tension between the space and the figures. I think that comes from my love of kind of early Flemish painting and Northern Renaissance painting rather than Japanese art. So
Yeah.
I was coming out to Japan using the subject matter, but in a way using European techniques, which is oil painting, and a kind of style that's influenced by European painting.
So let's talk about the subject matter then a little bit. This is you going to Japan 2003. Scholarship involves obviously learning the language in Tokyo.
Yeah.
Presumably a lot of this was completely new to you. If you cast
Yeah.
your mind back, what was jumping out at you as stuff that you wanted to draw?
Oh, it was
or
amazing.
paint?
Just everything. That was incredible. Just
Mm.
absolutely everything. I don't know how you felt. Perhaps you can
It's
talk about
visually
it.
so arresting, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know how you felt, but it's almost like you. I always got the feeling like when you arrive, you're almost like a newborn baby. In that you don't really have any references to. Well, I didn't anyway. To my past in a way, because everything's so different from the micro to the macro. You know, so there's just this kind of fresh slate, fresh visual slate was almost too much, and I had too many ideas, and I had to kind of boil it down into certain themes that I was most interested in. And I think that what I started to look at, because just before I went to Japan, I was doing a lot of portrait drawings
Right.
of people, kind of sitting with people like yourself and just doing sketches of them. I always wanted to combine people with places, but I hadn't really done that so far. So going to Japan, this idea of combining a person or a portrait with a place, that was the ideal opportunity. So I started to focus on areas of Tokyo like Shibuya and Shinjuku, where you had a lot of faces, like large crowds, against these Japanese signs and buildings. So I think that was my main starting point in Japan of combining portraits of Japanese people with the kind of vertical street signs and the kind of mishmash of buildings. That you can see examples of paintings, probably especially from maybe 100 years ago, where they're focusing on more traditional things like shrines and kimono and geisha. I kind of wanted to avoid that a little bit. Not that that's not interesting, but I didn't want to fall into kind of easy cliche. I was never going to go to Japan and just paint geishas.
Yes.
That's been done, and Japan's a lot more than that as well.
Talk us through perhaps one of your compositions. Is there one that has got a particular place in your heart because it was you getting used to this place, a first go at representing it?
There is one. The first piece of work I started making was based on Shibuya, a very large pencil ink drawing, very detailed. It's done very similar to this,
Oh yeah.
and in the same materials, but it's probably the size of this wall. Very large, detailed pencil drawing, and it was the kind of frenetic kind of overload of the senses of Shibuya, of the noise, the colors, the movement, the fact that, you know, very obvious thing to do, all the writing is different. You had these massive, you know, the culture has changed now in the UK and Japan since then, but I hadn't really seen these really huge outdoor televisions before. You know, you got them in Piccadilly Circus now, but they were really special to me, these massive screens where you see flashes of faces on the screens, kind of towering over these people scuttling about on the streets. So that area in the intersection, the famous scramble Kosaten, is Shibuya Scramble. That's what I focused on, and it's a difficult area to. I should say what I'm not trying to do in any of my work, and I think especially that one, is just take a photograph of somewhere and then just copy it exactly onto a canvas. That to me, it's slightly pointless, really. And so what I do is I do some sketches. I take a lot of photographs. What I do is go back to the studio and I kind of put it through my own filter and I move things around and I collage things until it retains the atmosphere and sense of the place. So someone looks at the picture, they think, oh, that should be it. But then you notice things are not exactly as they are. So I've moved buildings around. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine not giving a perfectly accurate topographical representation of Shibuya, as long as it feels like the place and it captures some of the atmosphere. So that work in particular was kind of like my springboard into making pictures of Tokyo.
I can ask about moving the buildings around for someone that doesn't know very much about art. Moving the buildings around, what would you be looking to achieve by doing
Well,
that?
strong composition. And this goes back to Hokusai and Hiroshige, who are absolute geniuses at composition. They're absolutely incredible. I don't know if you've ever tried to make pictures, Chris.
No, I can draw a stick man and a stick woman. That's about the limit.
Okay. Well, if you try to make your own compositions, you realize how incredible these guys were at composition. So I think that's what attracted me to those artists as well when I was a teenager looking at their compositions.
I want to ask a little bit more about these faces that are so much of a focus of your work. But before then, I think people might find it interesting. You made this really interesting comment about how people like Hokusai or Hiroshige were masters of composition. It's going to sound obvious. The one image of Hokusai that everyone knows is the Great Wave. Could you just briefly talk us through that in terms of what you as an artist see going on in terms of the composition? Is there something in that image in particular that we can look at and say, he was a genius and here's why?
I think with really, really iconic, incredibly strong pieces of work, it's very difficult to articulate why they're great. And again, it's that phrase is that if you could put it into words, there's no need to paint it. And it is true. One thing I would say that's interesting about that picture is that traditionally, with the writing system in Japan, you started from the right and you move left. Whilst in the West, you start with the left and move right. So if you look at that picture, it was designed to be seen from the right to left. So your eye travels into the wave, so the wave feels like it's falling into you. And that's why it has this sort of power. But in the West, when we read, we start from the left to right, so we travel with the wave. Simplification in those prints is extraordinary. Again, if you try to draw something, it's difficult enough, but if you really try to boil it down into its essence and just enough to show what that thing is, like that wave, it's incredibly difficult. It's much easier to make it, to put a lot of detail in, and to kind of reduce it down into its basic elements, I think is extraordinary, and those guys were masters at that.
Are there Japanese artists in your generation, my generation, who perhaps our readers and viewers haven't heard of, but who represent Japan in an interesting way, would be worth us looking up and engaging with. I'm thinking of specifically artists rather than photographers or any
Right.
other kind of arts.
Yeah, there's a really interesting painter called Tetsuya Ishida,
Right.
and he's a painter, oil on canvas, and he did a lot of self-portraits in contemporary Japanese urban environments,
Mm.
and he played with scale a lot. He put himself like stuck inside a building, or there's a really interesting atmosphere to his paintings where there's a strange sense of stillness and melancholia to his paintings that I find really interesting. Some people have said this about my work, so maybe that's why I'm attracted to his work. That there's a feeling of isolation or solitude to these things are not intentional; they just come out naturally. What I'm not trying to do is make a painting about urban isolation and saying, right,
Mm.
today I'm going to make a painting about urban isolation. I just paint people and environments quite directly, and
Yeah.
then the atmosphere comes out like that. So this painter Tetsuya Ishida, he has a similar feeling, but very different to my own. Another
Mm.
good painter that doesn't really show contemporary Japan, but just very interesting painters called Fuyuko Matsui,
Mm.
and she actually went to the same university I studied at, which is called Tokyo Geidai, Tokyo University of Arts, and she does Nihonga, Japanese painting,
Mm.
quite dark, a lot of self-portraits, kind of quite a little bit mythical. Then there's
Yeah.
the big names that everyone would have heard of, like Takashi Murakami and
Aye.
Yoshitomo Nara. I think they're great, but I think that they lean more on kind of pop culture rather than what I try to do, which is kind of document a society or culture.
We talked a bit about the early years in Japan.
Mm,
So then you decided, or you ended
mm,
up staying for
mm,
10 years
mm,
in Japan. So tell us a little bit about
mm.
why, what you were up to. And it would be really interesting, particularly to hear about the hibakusha painting.
As part of the Daiwa scholarship, as you know, you get to do a homestay. And I wanted to go to do my homestay in Hiroshima city because I wanted to meet and paint the portraits of Hibakusha. I read this great book. It's a very powerful book by an American journalist called John Hersey, and he interviewed, I think it was 6 survivors,
Mm.
and interviewed them, and through his words, he documented their experiences. My idea was to do a visual equivalent where I would document survivors visually and paint them. So when I was in Hiroshima City, I was introduced by an art curator in the city to some of the hibakusha, and then I was invited the year after by the same curator to come back specifically as an artist in residence and make portraits of hibakusha for an international art exhibition there. And it was a great privilege to meet these people. I did most of them in an elderly people's home in the city that is specialized for people who survived the atomic bomb.
Right.
As I would do with you, just sitting and documenting them as accurately as I could. And we would chat a little bit, and then for a couple of the hibakusha they invited, I did the portraits in their home, and their family would afterwards cook for me, and it was a wonderful experience. The scholarship is 18 months, I think 20 months.
Mm.
I just felt that was nowhere near enough time. I just dipped my little toe into this amazing world of Japan and the idea of painting it.
Mm.
And I thought this is just not enough time. So I applied for a couple of other scholarships and got them. And I ended up being a student at Tokyo University of Arts for 7 years. And then the final year, I won this great prize from the National Portrait Gallery where I had my own little exhibition after the 1 year of doing my own little project. It was a project that really worked out for me. I mean, financially as well. I sold all the paintings, and that was a springboard to becoming a professional artist. And now I make most of my living is from selling paintings. It's not just modern Japan; it's traditional Japan. I recently did a painting called Kintsugi about the pairing ceramics with gold and also can be with silver. So these traditional art and kind of masters, kind of learning their craft and spending years kind of making these beautiful artworks. I'm doing a painting about a craftsman making kokeshi dolls. So it's just a combination, like most people that are interested in Japan, they're not just interested in traditional Japan, they're not just interested in modern. It's just this multi-layered, multifaceted society where there's so many things to paint. You know, if I lived to be 500, I still wouldn't run out of ideas, I think, with Japan. I don't really have a set process that I can describe to you, but if I was to generalize, I think about subject matter that I'm interested in, and usually fairly quickly I have a kind of seed of an idea, a seed of a composition that comes into my head, and what I do is really quickly sketch it down, just through line, very, very quick. And they're called thumbnail sketches, very, very small physically and very, very quick. And that never matches exactly what's in my head anyway. I feel like there's a mysterious gap between what an image in your head, and then when you translate it into the real world, into shape, into line, into rhythm and pattern, etc. I did a picture called The Rice Farmer's Daughters.
Right.
This is quite a long time ago. And I just had this vague notion of rice fields, because I spent a few months kind of living in rice in areas where there's lots of rice fields. And then when I started to think about it and put the composition, then this idea of putting portraits into the foreground and two girls kind of communicating with each other. And then the background was maybe their grandfather or father. And then this sort of vague narrative started to take over the whole idea of the rice fields. So it didn't just become about the rice fields, it became about this sort of vague narrative between the figures in it, and this maybe a family of rice farmers. I flattened the rice field, so it becomes like a flat pattern, like a piece of textile, in contrast with the rounded three-dimensional portraits. You can see it in this picture a bit as well, quite realistically painted hands and head. Hopefully it looks quite 3D.
Yeah.
Then you can see the book and the clothes and the writing and the cup. They're very flat. So there's this sort of tension between 3 dimensions and flatness.
Yeah.
And just to go back to the beginning of our conversation about Hokusai and Hiroshige, they have a wonderful sense of, it's extraordinary. They managed to show space and flatten at the same time. I don't know how. I think they were magicians. I don't think they were real artists. I think they had some sort of magic how they managed to create their pictures.
Carl Randall, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Yeah.